Have you ever said yes to God, quietly, genuinely, with everything you had, and then found yourself wondering why the answer did not feel like a rival? Have you ever sensed that your desire to obey was real, and yet what followed looked more like confusion than clarity, more like silence than direction? Have you ever held a willingness so complete that it frightened you, and still felt that you were somehow not doing it right, that the obedience you were offering was not reaching where it needed to go? There is a moment in the spiritual life that almost no one warns you about. You stop bargaining, you stop negotiating the terms of your surrender. You come before God with an obedience that is, for the first time, total, and you wait. And what arrives is not the peace you expected. What arrives is a test so specific, so carefully designed, that it can only have been sent by someone who knows you completely. Her name was Catherine of Siena. She gave herself entirely to the will of God before she understood what that would cost her. And what she learned, what God taught her about the testing of true obedience, is among the most clarifying and compassionate teachings the Church has preserved. Subscribe, because real obedience is not a single moment. It is a formation, and you deserve to understand what that formation asks of you. We speak of obedience as though it is a door, a threshold you cross once, and having crossed it, the question is settled. You have said yes. You have surrendered your will. What remains is simply the living of what you agreed to. But Catherine of Siena knew something more precise than this. She knew it not through theological study alone, though her understanding of theology was, by the end of her life, extraordinary, but through the interior furnace of her own formation. She knew that obedience, when it is genuine, does not end the testing. It begins it. The testing of obedience is not a punishment. It is not God's skepticism about the sincerity of your surrender. It is something closer to what a craftsman does when a piece of work arrives that matters to him. He examines it. He tests the grain. He applies pressure at the points where pressure will one day come naturally in the life ahead, to see whether what appears solid is solid all the way through. This is the first thing to understand. The test that follows genuine obedience is a form of honor. Catherine entered the third order of the Dominicans, the Mantellate, at the age of around 16, after years of family resistance. Her family had wanted her to marry. She had refused with a quiet that was not stubbornness but simply certainty. The decision cost her significantly within her household. She was demoted essentially to the position of a servant, expected to do the most menial work, denied the solitude she had always needed, deliberately deprived of the interior life she had been building. And she did not resist. Not because she was passive, not because she did not feel the difficulty, but because she had understood something she later articulated in the dialogue with a precision that can only come from lived experience, which is that obedience is not proved in the moments of its expression, but in the moments of its cost. Anyone can obey when obedience is convenient. Anyone can surrender a will that was already pointing in the direction God is asking. The test of obedience comes when the surrender requires you to give up something you actually wanted. When the yes costs you a no that you did not want to say. In the dialogue, God says to Catherine, "I do not test obedience with easy things. Easy things do not reveal what the soul is made of. I test it with precisely what the soul holds most tightly, because what you hold most tightly is the last place I can reach, and I want to reach all of you." This is not severity. Read it again. The testing is the reaching. God tests what you hold tightly because He wants access to it, wants to transform it, to receive it, to fill the space it occupied with something it has been unknowingly blocking. You have likely felt this. The desire to obey was real. You came to prayer with something that felt like genuine surrender. And then the thing God seemed to ask was specifically the thing you were still holding. The relationship, the plan, the identity, the role, the future you had quietly arranged. And the obedience you had offered, the obedience you meant, suddenly had to be not general but particular. Not a posture but a decision. Not a feeling but an act. This is where most souls stumble, not because they are insincere, but because they did not understand that the obedience they offered at the level of feeling would one day be required at the level of action. That the surrender they expressed in prayer would be tested in the ordinary afternoon, in the specific circumstance, in the small and unremarkable moment where the will of God and the will of self arrive at the same intersection, and only one can go first. Catherine did not learn obedience in the chapel alone. She learned it in the kitchen, among the smoke and noise and unglamorous labor of a household that was not treating her well. She learned it in the silence of no recognition, in the absence of spiritual consolation, in the daily practice of doing what was asked of her without asking in return that it feel meaningful. And this matters enormously for you, because most of your obedience will not be dramatic. Most of it will be small. Most of it will happen in rooms no one will remember, in decisions that will not be recorded, in interior movements of the will that only God will see. The test of obedience is almost never theatrical. It is almost always intimate. What are you still holding? What did you think you surrendered but find yourself, in the specific circumstance, still managing, still shaping, still unwilling to fully release? That is the place where the test is happening. That is the place where Catherine is standing beside you, not to judge, but to witness. She has been there. She knows what it costs. She also knows what it opens. There is a specific suffering that belongs only to the obedient soul. It is not the suffering of consequence, the suffering that follows bad decisions, the weight of what we have done or failed to do. It is something more disorienting than that. It is the suffering that comes from doing exactly what you believed God was asking, and finding that the clarity which preceded the obedience has not followed you into it. You obeyed, and then the light went out. Catherine knew this darkness with precision. After her initial years of intense interior union, years of mystical experience, of consolation, of what she described as an almost constant sense of God's presence, she entered a period of profound desolation. She was not being punished. She had not gone astray. She had, in fact, deepened her obedience. And what arrived on the other side of that deepening was not more light. It was obscurity. This is one of the most important teachings in the Christian mystical tradition, and it is systematically underrepresented in ordinary spiritual formation. The dark night, in its various forms, is not a sign of spiritual failure. It is a sign of spiritual progress past the point where consolation is the primary mechanism of union. In the dialogue, God explains this to Catherine with a tenderness that is almost startling in its specificity. I withdraw the sense of my presence so that you will learn to seek me rather than the feelings I give. The soul that pursues sweetness has not yet learned love. The soul that pursues me when there is no sweetness, that soul is beginning to understand what love actually is. The testing of obedience through darkness is not cruelty, it is precision. God is asking a very specific question. Will you continue to obey when the obedience does not feel like anything? Because mature obedience, the obedience that will sustain a soul through the full arc of a life lived for God, cannot be built on feeling. Feeling is real and it is not to be dismissed. Catherine valued consolation and received it gratefully when it came, but feeling is not sufficient. Feeling changes. Feeling is affected by physical illness, by circumstance, by the interior weather of any given week. A soul that obeys only when it feels moved to obey is a soul whose obedience is conditional on comfort. God is not building a comfortable soul. He is building a faithful one. What does obedience in the dark look like? It looks from the outside indistinguishable from ordinary faithfulness. It looks like showing up to prayer when prayer feels hollow. It looks like maintaining the practices you established in seasons of consolation, carrying them through seasons of dryness without demanding that they return you to the feeling of before. It looks like continuing to say yes when the yes no longer comes with the accompanying warmth that made it feel easy. Catherine's obedience during her period of desolation was not passive. She remained active in prayer, active in the service of others, caring for the sick, accompanying the dying, writing letters, with a faithfulness that was, if anything, more radical than what she had practiced during her years of consolation. Because in consolation, the spiritual life carries a certain reward within itself. In desolation, the soul acts purely from love, from commitment, from the will given entirely to God, without the consolation of feeling it. This is the obedience that God is testing when He allows the darkness to come. He is not testing your emotion. He is testing your will. He is asking, beneath the warmth, beneath the feeling, beneath everything that made obedience feel beautiful, is there still a yes? Is there still a core of commitment that will hold when nothing around it feels supportive? The answer Catherine gave, the answer she gave across years, in darkness, with no assurance that the light would return, was yes. Her quiet, daily, unremarkable yes, given again and again in rooms where no one was watching, given in a faithfulness so consistent and so unperformative that it became, over time, the very shape of her soul. What she could not see, what she did not need to see, was that the darkness was doing something. It was not absence, it was formation. It was the particular kind of formation that can only happen in the absence of consolation, because consolation, by its nature, tells the soul it is in the right place. Darkness requires the soul to hold that knowledge without the confirmation, and the holding of it, the choosing to believe without feeling that God is present and that the obedience offered in His direction is not wasted. This is the act that reshapes the soul at its deepest level. Are you in a dark season? Does your obedience feel unwitnessed, felt by no one, confirmed by nothing, sustained only by your own decision to keep going? Then hear this. Catherine is very close to you in this. She is not watching from a distance. She is beside you in the dark, and she knows the shape of what you are carrying. She made it through not because the darkness ended on her schedule, but because she refused to let the darkness be the last word about God. The darkness is not the answer. It is part of the question, and the question held faithfully becomes its own form of prayer. There is a particular moment in Catherine's life that every person who has ever struggled with authority under God should know. It arrived not in the form of a mystical vision, though she had those, but in the form of a direct human command that required her to do something she had not chosen. Her confessor, Raymond of Capua, who would later become her biographer and one of her most devoted companions, asked her to leave the solitude she had maintained for 3 years and go into the public life of Florence, to work among the plague victims, to enter the political complexity of the city, to be available to people who needed her in ways that would leave no room for the interior quiet she had built her entire spiritual life around. Catherine resisted, not with anger, but with a genuine inner struggle that she did not hide from Raymond. She loved her solitude. She had cultivated it with great care. Her interior life was not an escape from the world. She was acutely aware of the world's needs, but the solitude was the vessel in which God had formed her, and she was being asked to leave it before she felt ready. And then she obeyed. This is the hardest form of obedience, and it is one that Catherine addresses with extraordinary care in the dialogue. It is the obedience that comes not directly from God's voice in prayer, but from the human structures He has placed in your life, the confessor, the spiritual director, the community, the legitimate authority that carries, imperfectly and humanly, the weight of God's will. God says to her in the dialogue, "I could speak to every soul directly. I could bypass every human mediation and give my will without a vehicle. But this is not how I have chosen to work in the world. I work through the imperfect, through the limited, through the uncertain, through those who themselves need my mercy. This is not because I lack power. It is because the soul that learns to find me in the imperfect mediator is the soul that has learned to find me everywhere. The obedience that moves through people is the obedience that stretches the soul in a specific way. It requires you to detach not just from your own will, but from your judgment about the person delivering the instruction. Because the messenger is always imperfect. The confessor has blind spots. The community makes mistakes. The institution that carries God's grace does so in broken vessels. And if your obedience is conditional on the perfection of the vehicle, it will rarely survive contact with the actual church, the actual community, the actual human beings God sends to guide you. Catherine obeyed Raymond. She left her solitude. She went to Florence. She worked in the streets during the plague, carrying the dying, accompanying executions, writing letters that moved pontiffs. She became one of the most influential women in 14th century Europe, not despite her obedience to a human authority, but through it. The formation that happened in her solitude was poured through the channel of her obedience into the world, and the world was changed. But here is what we do not often notice. Her obedience to Raymond did not silence her. She was, famously, one of the boldest voices in the church of her century. She wrote letters to Pope Gregory XV in a tone that could only be described as maternal severity, urging him to leave Avignon and return to Rome. She called cardinals to account. She spoke truth to the highest authorities of her time without apology. This is not contradiction. This is the freedom that obedience produces. The soul that has genuinely surrendered its will to God is not a passive soul. It is a free one. It has nothing to protect, nothing to manage, nothing to perform. It can speak the truth clearly precisely because it is not defending a self-interest. The obedient soul is the most dangerous kind of voice in the church because it cannot be silenced by threat and cannot be bought by reward. It has already given the only thing that matters. This is what God is forming in you when He tests your obedience through human authority. He is not asking you to become small. He is asking you to become free, free enough that your yes and your no both come from the same source, the same deep surrender, the same trust in a God who moves through the imperfect toward the perfect. Where in your life is God asking you to obey a human voice that you are not sure carries His authority? Where is He calling you to trust the structure even when the structure is imperfect? And in that trust, in that difficult, specific, costly obedience, what might He be trying to form in you that could not be formed any other way? There is a transformation that happens to the soul that has been tested in obedience over a long period of time. It is a transformation so complete that those who observe it from the outside sometimes mistake it for passivity or for a kind of spiritual resignation, a dulling of the edges, a diminishment of self. It is the opposite. What happens to the soul that has been tested in obedience, tested in darkness, tested through human authority, tested in the small and specific moments where the will of self and the will of God arrived at the same intersection? What happens to that soul over time is that obedience stops being a practice and becomes a nature. Catherine of Siena describes this in the dialogue with one of the most beautiful images in the Christian mystical tradition. She speaks of the soul that has undergone the full formation of obedience as a vessel that has been shaped by a craftsman's hands until it holds exactly what was always meant to fill it. The shaping was not comfortable. The clay resisted. The vessel cracked more than once and had to be remade, but the result is something that could not have been achieved without the pressure, a form that corresponds perfectly to the gift that God always intended to place inside it. This is the end of the testing of obedience, if there is an end, not the absence of further testing. Catherine was tested until the last days of her life, but the arrival at a place where the testing no longer finds the same resistance, not because the soul has been emptied of personality, but because the personality has been aligned with God so thoroughly that the distinction between what the soul wants and what God asks has, in the deepest places, collapsed. In the dialogue, God says, "The soul that has learned true obedience does not obey because it is afraid of getting it wrong. It obeys because it no longer wants anything else, not because it has given up on desire, but because its desire has been transformed, until what it desires most is what I desire for it, and the two are the same." This is the freedom Catherine was pointing toward with her entire life. Not the freedom from constraint. She had more constraints than most, but the freedom of alignment. The freedom of a will so completely given that it can move through the world without the constant friction of resistance. The freedom of a soul that does not need to manage its own life because it has entrusted the management to hands more capable and more loving than its own. She did not arrive at this quickly. The formation took decades. It moved through solitude and through public life, through consolation and through darkness, through direct mystical experience and through the exhausting, unglamorous work of serving the sick and mediating political crises and accompanying condemned men to their executions. The obedience was not a single event. It was a daily practice that became, over time, a daily disposition, and then, at the deepest level, simply the shape of her soul. And this is what God is doing in you, in the specific testing you are living right now, in the particular form of obedience He is asking of you in this season. He is not asking for a performance. He is not asking for an impressive gesture. He is working with great patience and extraordinary precision toward the transformation of your deepest desires, toward the moment, which may not come all at once, when what you want for yourself and what God wants for you begin, quietly and irreversibly, to converge. The testing is the path to that convergence. The darkness is part of it. The human authority is part of it. The small, unremarkable yes given in the ordinary afternoon is part of it. And Catherine, who knows the full length of that path because she walked every inch of it, Catherine is not ahead of you, impatient, waiting for you to catch up. She is beside you. She knows the weight of what you are carrying. She knows the specific terrain of the interior life in the season of testing. She has interceded for souls in this exact place, souls who were willing but tired, souls who were faithful but unsure, souls who had said yes and were still saying it, one day at a time, in the absence of the confirmation they had hoped for. She intercedes for you now, and what she asks for on your behalf is not that the testing end before it has done its work. She asks for the grace to endure it with her characteristic clarity, the grace to understand what God is building, and to cooperate with the building, and to trust that the shape He is giving you is the shape that corresponds exactly to the gift He has always wanted to give. Remain in the testing, stay in the obedience. The vessel is being made, the craftsman has not abandoned it, and the gift He intends to place inside you is worth every moment of the making. You stayed. You gave 30 minutes to something that no algorithm required of you. No notification pushed you toward, no social obligation made necessary. You chose this, and that choice, small, quiet, unremarkable to everyone but God, is itself a form of the obedience we have been speaking about. If what you heard today reached something in you, if the teaching of Catherine has accompanied you before, or if today was the first time her voice found you, I want to invite you to go deeper. This channel exists for exactly one thing: to bring the great saints of the Church into real conversation with the real interior life you are living. Not as historical figures, not as plaster statues, as living intercessors, as guides who have walked the most difficult terrain of the spiritual life and left behind maps precise enough to be followed. If you want to be part of what this channel is building, if you want to support the work of bringing Catherine and Faustina and the whole company of the saints into this kind of sustained, serious, loving dialogue, consider becoming a member. Every contribution makes it possible to go further, to go deeper, to reach more souls who are right now in the testing, wondering whether anyone has been where they are. You have found this place. That is not an accident. Stay. Bring others. Help us go further together. Come and be covered too.